Welcome, everyone, to the Spiritual Brew Pub. I'm your host, Michael Camp. Today, I'm really excited because we've got Matthew Taylor with us. Matthew is a senior scholar at the Institute for Islamic, Christian, and Jewish Studies. He's a specialist in American Christianity, American Islam, Christian extremism, and religious politics. Moreover, he's the author of a just-released book that we're going to talk about, The Violent Take It by Force, the Christian movement that is threatening our democracy. Matthew, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Yeah. And so, Matthew, this is a critical topic. We're only a week away or so from the 2024 election, and your book is so well researched. I know some of the players in the book, and I know you've done a good job because it fits with my real life experience. And it's very informative, and it's really a must-read book for people to understand Christian Trumpism, the January 6th insurrection, what was going on behind the scenes, and what's going on today. And, for people in the audience, I mean, most people, we know the voices and characters of Rudy Giuliani, Roger Stone, Steve Bannon, Sidney Powell, and all these other people who were behind Trump's big lie about the election being stolen. But we don't know about these people that you put in your book. And it's really critical that we know them. They're people and the leaders of the religious right, particularly from within the charismatic movement, who are supporting Trump and doing all this stuff behind the scenes, and not just behind the scenes, as we'll learn on January 6th, they were there and they were present. So why is this important? Because this is a Christian nationalist, supremacist type movement that's very active and is threatening our democracy. And they have, as people know my story, I'm always critiquing the theology behind these groups because I used to be in them and I understand what they believed. I believed it myself, but there's definitely a warped theology that needs to be exposed as dangerous to equality in our American way of government by the people, dangerous to democracy. So why don't we get started and just tell us about why did you write the book? What's your goal?
Well, I wrote the book because I wanted to sound a warning. When I started this research, I started right after January 6th. I mean, I was watching on January 6th as the Capitol riot played out, and I could see the evangelical symbolism, the evangelical iconography, evangelical music, evangelical Bible citations, just in the presentation of the crowds that day. And as somebody who grew up within evangelicalism and knows that world well, I just had a lot of questions. I wanted to know who were the leaders behind this? What were the theologies that were driving this? How did Christians get drawn so deeply into this attack on our democracy? And that's what led me to the new Apostolic Reformation and these set of leaders and the ideas that they are driving. And then when I first started writing this, I really thought it would be a historical project, kind of reconstructing what happened. Mm-hmm. And then about a year into the research, I started realizing, oh no, wait, these folks are gearing up to do this again.
This might
they're more
happen
popular.
Again.
Yeah, they're more popular today than they were on January 6th. Their ideas are spreading rapidly. Yeah. And they are still banded together around Trump, still believing the lies about the 2020 election, still driving those narratives to their audiences. And I started worrying that the violence we saw on January 6th might only be the precursor.
Yeah, that's scary. So one of the things that struck me when I read the stories was, we know where we could probably tell you ourselves, where were we on January 6th? It was such a pivotal day. And what I didn't realize is that these people, I knew there were Christians at these rallies. I had asked some people, said, yeah, I knew from some friends who went there. But what I didn't realize that they were actually behind the scenes praying, worshiping, singing, right, as the January 6th riders were coming into the Capitol. I mean, can you tell us about that? What was that all about?
Yeah, so the focus of my book is less on the people who went into the Capitol, the people who committed acts of violence. I feel like we've gotten a lot of background on those folks. There's been all kinds of news reporting. There's the January 6th report. My focus is on the crowds around the Capitol. That's really where you saw thousands of Christians gathered. I mean, there were definitely Christians who went in and committed violence, but most of the Christians who were there, especially the charismatic Christians who were there, understood themselves and their presence there that day as a part of spiritual warfare, of battling in the spirit realm to put Trump back into office. And they believe there's a real interface between the spiritual realm and the physical, natural world that we inhabit. And so that I really became interested in understanding what drew people there that day, who were the leaders that mobilized people there for that day, what were the theologies they were participating in, what were the spiritual practices that were being used by the people in those crowds. And I also as I started digging into and tracing out, okay, who are the Christians who are there, what were the influences on them, I started recognizing there were these vast networks of other Christians who weren't necessarily present that day, but were egging on the Christians who were there. We're saying, we're supporting you. Thousands and thousands of Christians have turned their attention and their focus to the Capitol that day. And whether they were there on site or not, were praying and doing spiritual warfare and sending messages to the people who were there saying, keep fighting, keep doing this. We need to change this election. We need to overturn this. And I think that's part of what fueled the chaos and the fervor of that day, was this kind of mass fixation and belief that this was the turning point in American history. And the support from these vast networks of people was really one of the driving forces for the chaos that day.
Right. So there wasn't just the people that were there praying on the sidelines. There were other people, thousands other people supporting the whole thing in the background, not on site.
And I describe in the book a couple of prayer calls that I've been able to track down that were happening in the middle of the Capitol riot. So there were people live streaming from the Capitol riot. There were also collective prayer and spiritual warfare calls. At least one of them had more than 4,000 people on it. Another one had at least 1,500 people on it. That's in addition to the people who are watching live streams from the people who were present at the Capitol, who were praying in support of the agenda of the crowds that day to overturn the election and to see the Donald Trump put back into office. And those people, most of them were not on site. Most of them were praying remotely for the events that were going on at the Capitol.
Right. Okay. So we're going to get into, all right, who this group is, this movement, and why in the world and how could they believe this stuff in light of all the facts that came out in the courts and everything, that there was no evidence of fraud, etc. But tell us a little bit about who these people are, this particular group of charismatics that are called the New Apostolic Reformation.
Yeah, so this phrase, New Apostolic Reformation, it's coined in 1996, and it really centers around a man named C. Peter Wagner. Wagner was a seminary professor at Fuller Theological Seminary. He was an expert in a field called church growth, kind of a faddish evangelical field in the 1970s, 1980s, 1990s, that was centered on how do you engineer growth in Christian communities, using the data of social science, blending that with evangelical theology to produce megachurches, to produce mass missions movements. And this was Wagner's area of expertise. And he became, over the course of the 1980s and 1990s, became especially fixated on one particular segment of the global church. And this is where the form of non-denominational governance meets charismatic spirituality. So this is what scholars will sometimes call the independent charismatic sector of Christianity. You can think of it as kind of a non-denominational wing of Pentecostalism. And so in that arena, there have been these ideas that have been kicking around for several decades about, again, it's non-denominational, so there's not a lot of structure. And so these ideas about we need to renew the offices of apostles and prophets we find described in the New Testament. Wagner did not come up with that idea. Many people fed that idea to him, and he embraced that idea. But then he became kind of the figurehead of the movement. Because he was a seminary professor, he was writing books. He wrote dozens of books over the course of his career. And he became kind of the spokesperson and the organizer of networks of these apostles and prophets. And he called those networks, again, the New Apostolic Reformation. He thought that it was going to be a revolution in the life of the global church on the order of the Protestant Reformation. He really thought this was a new Reformation built around these apostles and prophets that would inaugurate a grand global revival that would transform the face of the global church, and that would bring about, in many ways, the end of the world, the end of time, through this kind of grand third great awakening.
Right. No, this is so familiar, Matthew. I went to a church in Southern California that was part of People of Destiny that became Sovereign Grace Ministries. They were into the apostles and the prophets right then, and my pastor Chayon was being mentored by Peter Wagner at Fuller Seminary, right there in the 1980s, and so that was the seeds of all this. And so we heard about that all the time, and we didn't call it. No one called it the New Apostolic Reformation at the time, but they were calling it other stuff, the Apostolic Age or whatever, and that was the big deal back then, especially in our denomination. Was we need to recover the offices of apostles and prophets, just like it is in the New Testament, and that's what's going to bring revival and hasten the return of Christ and all these things. So, been there, done that, seen that. So, and after I left that church, it grew and grew, and I witnessed it on the sidelines. Sometimes I was still in it for a while, but I witnessed it on the sidelines, especially, and it just became huge. I mean, we went, our little church, maybe at the time in 1989 when I left, there might have been 200 or 300 people, which we thought was big, but now it's a mega church, and these movements led by some of the people that you're going to talk about, they can pretty much snap their fingers, get the promotion they need, and have thousands of people show up at a stadium or in Washington D.C. It's just amazing, the networking.
No, and they are very good at mass events, mass gatherings, and they have a huge following. I mean, and it's not only. I think sometimes we're tempted to think always in terms of kind of brick and mortar churches. Like, okay, well, what's their church, right? How many people attend to their church? Some of these leaders don't have a church. Some of them are just online leaders. They're online prophets. Some of them, but they can have hundreds of thousands, even millions of followers online, and they'll go and speak at a conference with 10 or 20,000 people, and they're followers of these leaders who don't attend brick and mortar churches. They only follow this kind of pantheon of apostles and prophets online, and then show up at these big conferences or do private worship services in their own home, right? So it's a new and emerging model of doing Christianity that has not still fully congealed, but is very, very popular today.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I call it stadium Christianity. I mean, it's just bizarre. I mean, it's a combination of everything that's like the Billy Graham crusade model, and then the charismatic model put together, and revival and all this other stuff. There's just something about the numbers of people, and then they claim all the people are praying and fasting, and so that's going to move God to do something, right? So it's all about, well, I call it divine arm twisting, but that's another conversation. But the question is, how did these people, many of them started from much more humble beginnings, like my pastor Chayon, but how did they get radicalized to the degree that they became really not just, I'm going to vote for Trump because he's pro-life or something, but literally backing him as if he's called by God to be the president of the United States?
Yeah, and this is the story I'm trying to tell in the book, is how does a group of very intelligent, very capable, very popular leaders who I mean, in many ways are quite grounded in the 1990s. They many of them have large followings and people looking to them. I mean, they have big audiences. How does a group like that become so radicalized that they would be one of the driving factors of something like January 6th. So the NAR, the New Apostolic Reformation, as it started kind of getting off the ground in the 1990s, started out as a movement to reform the church.
Okay.
As an ecclesiastical reform movement. How do we change the governance and structure of the church in order to bring about this grand revival? Right. And there were still, I mean, there definitely were delusions of grandeur in there, right? Of like, we are the modern day apostles and prophets who can change the face of global Christianity, right? There was plenty of great delusions of grandeur, but it was focused on the life of the church. And then in the early 2000s, another leader came and entered these networks, and his name was Lance Wallnau.
Okay.
And Lance Wallnau, who understood himself to be an apostle and a prophet, claimed that he had a new prophecy. And he kind of cobbled this together from some other things that other leaders were saying and kind of branded it slightly differently. So it's not entirely original.
No, it's not new because it was around in the 80s and 90s too.
Yeah, and there was a kind of a previous version. So the previous version was called the Seven Spheres. But Wallnau added this imagery of mountains, and this becomes this idea, this kind of meme called the Seven Mountain Mandate. And the basic idea is you can divide society up into 7 different arenas: religion, family, government, education, arts and entertainment, media, commerce. And that they imagine every one of those, and these are in every society, right? It's not specific to the United States, but in every society, those 7 mountains, those 7 arenas are mountains. They imagine them as a physical mountain. And the top of that mountain, the position of control over that arena, is either held by God and the Christians or by Satan and the demons. There's no in between, right? It's completely binary, completely Manichaean. It's either Christians are in control of society or everything belongs to Satan. And so the mandate part of this, their understanding of what God is directing them to do, is for Christians to go into every one of those mountains, not only focus on religion, focus on government, focus on education, and try to take over the top of those mountains, take on positions of influence and power over those mountains so that Christian influence and morality and ideas can flow down into society. And I just want to note, Michael, that when we think about the rise of the religious right in the 1980s and 1990s, I mean, so a lot of people want to see the January 6th as kind of the culmination of the rise of the religious right. I actually think that there's some discontinuity there. Because in the original religious right, and I grew up in that world, and I have many critiques of that world, so I'm not saying, oh, that was all good and fine, but that the model of social change in the original religious right was through democracy.
Yeah,
we are the moral majority. We are the Christian coalition. If we can just get Christians voting, just get Christians kind of mobilized politically, then we can change American politics and bring about our vision of the United States. But using the mechanisms and rules of democracy. The Seven Mountain Mandate is a top-down revolutionary model of social change. You take over positions of power and then institute change from the top down. That's a vanguard model. Right? That's not a democratic model of change. And so it's not from the grassroots, it's from the top. And so this is a much more aggressive vision of a Christian America or Christianizing society than even what a Jerry Falwell or some of his cohort were thinking about in the 80s and 90s.
No, that's definitely true. Because I mean, I remember there was this group called the Reconstructionists, and they were more like theocracy type thing. And we were like, oh, no, we're not like that. Right. We don't want that. We want influence. We want, for people to, the majority of people to be Christians so that it's still a democracy, right? And you've got, it was a different way of approaching it. And then sometime, like you said, the Seven Mountains Mandate, it was like, even though we said we wanted democracy. I remember Chuck Colson coming out and saying, no, we don't want theocracy. And he wrote a book about it or something. But we still wanted control. We still expected to get the majority and to get control. Right. And so this new Seven Mountains Mandate, I guess maybe was the shortcut to get there.
and the idea is, so if you go back in history, the Reconstructionists, a set of kind of Calvinist Reformed theologians in the 1960s, 1970s, 1980s, very influential on the early religious right. But what happened was some of these ideas from the Reconstructionists, these theocracy ideas, it's often encoded around this term dominion.
Yep.
It's called dominion theology. Sometimes people will talk about dominionism. So dominion became this kind of theme that the charismatics drew from the Reconstructionists. And this was a very intentional kind of cross-pollination between these movements by leaders on both sides. And they kind of grabbed hold of some of these themes, and then they get encoded in different ways in the kind of charismatic movements. And the Seven Mountain Mandate is one of the major kind of charismatic rebrandings of dominion theology with this more aggressive idea of we need to Christianize America. And the other thing was the Reconstructionists were very gradualist in their orientation. We need to like slowly Christianize society.
Right.
When you add these kind of charismatic power dimensions, God is going to miraculously intervene.
Right.
That's where the Seven Mountains becomes this more active vision, this more revolutionary vision where when God steps in, then the church can institute its own vision.
And even God picks and chooses someone to be president, etc.
Yes.
They take over. So tell us about, how did Trump get connected with these folks? I think you have a story about Paula White. Tell us about that. I do.
First, I have a story about Sarah Palin, though, because that's an important backstory to this.
Okay, yeah, go back a little farther then.
So these ideas, the kind of dominion ideas, and Peter Wagner writes this landmark book titled Dominion, ! In early 2008. The Seven Mountains ideas are getting integrated into the New Apostolic Reformation around the same time. And it's in the middle of 2008 that John McCain selects Sarah Palin to be his running mate. And Sarah Palin had kind of grown up in these circles. She'd been mentored by an NAR prophet named Mary Glazier in Alaska. And she attended churches. She'd had a number of these NAR apostles come through her church and pray over her and prophesy over her. And so Sarah Palin was deeply connected with these folks, and they saw her as a part of their movement. And so they were very, very excited, right? Because they're like, we get to take dominion through Sarah Palin. She's gonna conquer the government mountain for us. And then of course McCain and Palin lose, and Obama and Biden come into office. And so there was this sense after the defeat of McCain and Palin within these kind of NAR circles of desperation, right? They have this vision of Christian control over America, but they feel like it's slipping away from them, and they were very, very opposed to the Obama administration. But they're integrated into some of these right-wing activist circles. And so when Donald Trump enters the presidential race in the summer of 2015, in June of 2015, these independent charismatics, they kind of perked up because Donald Trump, he kind of fit their vision of what a leader should look like, right? He has a televangelist flair about him, right? I mean, he's got the strange hair and the relentless positivity about himself. He's always trying to sell you something. He's always trying to get you to give him some money. And so he kind of fit the aesthetic of this world. Right. And it's also just so happened that Donald Trump was very close to this woman, Paula White. And she kind of has served as...
he met Paula White long before, right?
Yeah, in 2002. So Paula White is a televangelist, a megachurch pastor in Florida, and Trump was at Mar-a-Lago, and he was flipping through the channels, and he'd actually, at least according to Paula White, is quite the consumer of televangelism. He watches not like out of devotion, but out of kind of fascination. He's kind of intrigued by the televangelists. Right. And so he sees Paula White preaching and on TV, and he gives her a call just out of the blue. And he tells her, I mean, it's the start of their conversation is he calls her and he says, I saw you on TV. You have the it factor. And her response was, sir, we call that the anointing. And this starts a friendship, and she winds up becoming sort of his personal pastor. She was doing this for other celebrities as well at the time, like Kid Rock. She facilitated Kid Rock's marriage with Pamela Anderson. She even ministered to Michael Jackson after some of his scandals. And so she becomes kind of a personal pastor to Donald Trump. She buys a condo in Trump Tower in New York and would visit with him when she was in New York. And so as he enters the presidential race, he turns to Paula White. She had just gotten married at that point, so she's now Paula White Kane. And he said, "Can you be my liaison to the evangelicals?" Right. But the funny thing is, Paula White herself is not a traditional evangelical by any stripe, right? So she's a female preacher, which most evangelicals don't accept. She's a prosperity gospel preacher, which most evangelicals don't accept. She's
Right.
a televangelist and a mega church pastor, and she's an apostle. She understands herself to be an apostle. And so she doesn't have a Rolodex with James Dobson and Ralph Reed in it. She knows NAR types. She knows televangelism types. And so those are the people she starts inviting in to meet with Donald Trump. And these meetings start in the fall of 2015 at Trump Tower.
Okay.
And there's a series of them. And these are the first Christian leaders to meet with candidate Trump. They're some of the first Christian leaders to endorse candidate Trump. And they become the nucleus of Donald Trump's evangelical advisors, come out of these meetings in the fall of 2015 that Paula White is organizing. And there's a couple of NAR folks who are in that group, including Lance Walnut, the Seven Mountains guy.
Okay.
And when he meets Trump at Trump Tower, Walnut claims that he receives a prophecy about Trump, that Donald Trump is supposed to be an Isaiah 45 Cyrus. And just to unpack that, right, because that's kind of an obscure reference. Cyrus is the emperor of the Persian Empire in the 6th century BCE, right? If you remember your history of the nation of Israel, Israel split into two parts. The northern kingdom gets destroyed and taken away. The southern kingdom of Judah, the Jews, they get conquered by the Babylonian Empire, and they get taken away into exile in Babylon.
Right.
But then Cyrus and the Persians conquer the Babylonian Empire, overtake the Babylonian Empire, and Cyrus sends the Jewish people back to rebuild Jerusalem and rebuild the temple. And so in Isaiah, in chapter 45, Isaiah is trying to kind of think about how is it that this obscure pagan ruler played such an important role in Israelite history. And so in Isaiah 45, Cyrus is referred to as the anointed of God. And anointed, that word in Hebrew is Mashiach. It's where we get the term Messiah.
Messiah, right, exactly.
And so to call Donald Trump a Cyrus figure, in Isaiah 45 Cyrus, Walnut is saying he's not a good Christian. He's not a part of the nation of Israel. He's not a part of the people of God, but he's an instrument in the hand of God that God is using to deliver, in Walnut's vision, conservative Christians from their cultural exile.
Right.
And this becomes then part of the rationale for why evangelicals come to support Trump. This is, and Walnut is saying this before, a single vote has been cast in any primary. He's saying God has anointed Donald Trump, and he even goes on to say that he thinks that Donald Trump is elected by God to serve in office, to become the president.
Right.
And this becomes then part of the rationale and propaganda that is used to sell Donald Trump to evangelicals. They're like, hey, he might not be a good Christian. He might be a bad dude, but he's God's bad dude. He is God's weapon.
Right.
God will use to push back and fight back against our enemies. He doesn't have Christian virtues because Cyrus didn't have godly virtues, but God can use him to protect us. Right. And this becomes then part of this campaign among evangelicals in order to get them surrounding and supporting Donald Trump.
No, it's fascinating to hear all this. What strikes me is that there was still this notion that, well, we need someone like Donald Trump, right?
Yeah.
Like, there wasn't this notion of, it doesn't matter who's president, we can have influence in society. No, we need someone like Donald Trump. And I guess it went back to George W. Bush. He was supposed to be God's man too, Yeah. And so there was always this push of getting a president, an executive in who's either a Christian or, in this case, is on our side. Yes. and is supposedly anointed by God. So it's fascinating to hear that. It was not, Donald Trump became, decided to run for president, and then people heard what he had to say, and they said, okay, we'll support them. There was a concerted effort. Leaders were connected to him. And then, they went out and told their people, so to speak, look, we've met with Trump, we prayed with him, here's a prophecy about him. People wrote books about prophecies about him. Here are the credentials. You can back this guy.
Yeah. Right. And part of the what's going on in this process too is what happens over the course of that 2016 primary is this kind of idiosyncratic, eccentric group of charismatic televangelists, messianic rabbis, prophets, apostles, gathers around Donald Trump and starts promoting him. And the mainstream evangelical right doesn't want anything to do with Trump during the 2016 primary, right? He does not look like their ideal. But you have this other group of these avant-garde evangelical leaders who are supporting Trump. And as Trump wins the primaries, the old guard of the religious right starts realizing, hey, he's gonna be the candidate.
Right. So
we need access.
Yeah. That's what brought them on board, was when they realized actually he's going to win the primary and there's a good chance he could win.
Yes.
Okay, now what do we do with our people, right?
Yes.
And I think that's when James Dobson and some other people kind of claimed, I know someone who led Trump to Christ, or he's just a baby Christian or whatever.
Exactly. Yeah. So then everyone else kind of follows along. But by that point, Paula White and this inner circle had already congealed. And so they're now the gatekeepers.
Yeah, and they become the gatekeepers.
And the old guard of the religious right are on the outside looking in, right? And this is an inversion of power.
Yeah.
It's very similar, I would say, to what has happened in the Republican Party overall, right? Where Donald Trump comes onto the scene and everyone's like, he's crazy, he's insane. And the establishment Republicans reject him.
Yeah.
But it's these fringy outsiders, the Steve Bannons, the Stephen Millers, the Roger Stones, the Michael Flynn's, who band together around Trump. And because Trump is revolutionizing the party, that those previously fringe people become part of the carpet. They become the ones who are driving the action in Republican politics. And that today, what we would have called kind of the establishment of the Republican Party, many of them wouldn't even call themselves Republican anymore,
right,
if they're even part of the coalition, because they've been so forced out to the margins by this kind of populist authoritarian MAGA movement. That same dynamic is playing out within evangelicalism today.
Yeah, that's fascinating. So this NAR type of charismatics, they have a very particular theology, and one of the things that they believe in is the spirit world, much more than your typical evangelicals, although they would too. But they have a way of, I was taught this when I was in churches like this. They have a way of thinking about the world. And you implied it before when you talked about, the us versus them, we've got the spirit, and everyone else, if they're not Christians, if they're not true believers, then they're under the influence of the devil, right? So what does this movement believe about demons and spiritual warfare and things like territorial spirits and worship as a weapon?
So I want to distinguish between spiritual warfare in general and this NAR vision of spiritual warfare.
Right. Okay.
So, because spiritual warfare as a concept is very, very popular, very widespread.
Exactly.
Practiced by many evangelicals, many Pentecostals, many Catholics. And the basic idea of spiritual warfare, and this comes out of especially the book of Ephesians, but other passages in the Bible, is the idea that there's this unseen spiritual realm all around us, filled with these angels and demons who are battling, right? The forces of God versus the forces of Satan, battling for control of the world. And that warfare affects human beings, right? And this is where you might encounter Christians who are talking about, I feel plagued by these demonic forces today, or I need to spend some time reading the Bible because I feel like there's a darkness around me or something. Right. And so most spiritual warfare is what people do as kind of a personal practice. I'm going to sing listen to worship music to reinvigorate my soul. At the extreme end, maybe I'm going to perform an exorcism on this person to get the demons out of them, right? But it's about protecting yourself, protecting your community. Well, Peter Wagner and these early NAR leaders come along in the 1990s and they say, that's all fine and good. We support that kind of spiritual warfare, but we need something much more dramatic. We need something on a bigger scale. And Wagner coins the phrase, we need strategic level spiritual warfare, by which he means we need mass campaigns of spiritual warfare organized by particular leaders that can drive out the high level demons, because they start thinking, well, there's hierarchies of demons. All those people, they're just dealing with the foot soldiers. We need to take out the generals among the demons. And Wagner, this is where Wagner takes this concept, that this hazy concept in the book of Ephesians, the powers and principalities, these kind of nefarious, malign spiritual forces that are referenced in Ephesians. And he says, those are actually territorial spirits, high-ranking demon commanders who control literal physical territory. And the mission of the church is to expand Christian spiritual territory and conquer spiritual territory. And in order to do that, we have to drive out these territorial spirits. And this is where the apostles and prophets come in. As he says, apostles and prophets are generals of spiritual warfare who have the authority to mobilize these mass campaigns of spiritual warfare, get hundreds of thousands, even millions of Christians praying in concert against these demons, but then also to do the casting out, to do the exorcisms, because the apostles and prophets has a special authority. They can see into the spirit realm, identify the territorial spirits, and then cast them out.
Oh my.
This is, if you follow what happens on January 6th, a big part of what is going on January 6th is it's a spiritual warfare campaign to drive out the territorial spirits they believe are hijacking the election from Trump.
Yeah, this is so familiar. So, couple things. This notion of territorial spirits, part of it, I think, came out of the missions movement.
Yes.
Because, you would go to the mission field and there would be, gee, we're not converting very many people. This is a Muslim society or whatever. And there must be something holding back these people from, because to me, this was just a way of explaining away the fact that maybe something is wrong with our good news if people aren't actually accepting it. So you come up with something. And this is one of the things that was come up with. Oh, there's some kind of a territorial spirit. And I think Youth with a Mission taught this, and you go in there and you break those spirits first, and then you bring the gospel, right? And so that same notion gets carried over into this movement who's becoming more and more political. And now all of a sudden there's a big obstacle. Trump claims that the election is stolen, and the terrible, evil liberals and Democrats are all orchestrating a steal. Then we've got to come against these territorial spirits and drive them out so that people can see this and we can restore everything.
Yes.
And so that's what's going on. And it's crazy when you dissect it. But there is an element to it that makes sense, because there is, like you said, it's always been an evangelicalism, but also there's an element that says, yeah, there really is some evil in the world, right? Whether it's a real spirit or not, whether it's a real demon or not, is another question, right? So, folks, we've been talking with Matt Taylor, and his book is The Violent Take It by Force. And we're going to continue on here in a moment and continue on with our conversation. Okay, that's where I'm going to put my ad in. So, so Matt, let's just move on. This is fascinating history. You did some research on a couple of my former pastors, Chayon and Lou Engel, who I was friends with when they planted a church in Pasadena, California. And my wife and I were part of that church for 5 years, and we became pretty good friends with them. And, they were nice, well-meaning people. I was in the evangelical movement at the time, and I believed a lot of this stuff at the time. And then later on, I started to see some things, even while I was there, that wasn't lining up. But tell us about your research of those two people and what role they play in the NAR.
So yeah, Chayon and Lou Engel were friends. They actually, I'm in Baltimore. They were met here in Maryland, actually.
Right.
This is where Chayon grew up, and so they get involved with this network, this kind of early expression of some of these apostle and prophet ideas called People of Destiny. That's anchored here in Maryland, and they go to Che believes that he receives a message in a dream that he's supposed to start a church in Pasadena, in Los Angeles. Yep. And so he and Lou move across country with the sponsorship of this People of Destiny network to start a church in Pasadena. That church, the church you were part of, at least in their narrative, doesn't become what they want it to be. And they get very disappointed. And along the way, Che has started going to Fuller Seminary and connecting with Peter Wagner, taking classes with Peter Wagner. They get very, very excited about some of these NAR ideas, and there's a whole episode around the Toronto blessing I can get into if you want. But basically, they get enmeshed in this kind of early proto-NAR social space centered around Peter Wagner. And as Wagner starts launching the New Apostolic Reformation, Chay and Lou just throw in with Wagner. They become some of his chief acolytes. They're really, I mean, the church they eventually start after the church you were part of, the later church is called Harvest Rock. Even in the 1990s, they're calling it one of the new apostolic churches, right? They're mimicking Wagner's terminology.
Excellent, absolutely.
And it's around that same time in the late 90s that Chayons starts an apostolic network called Harvest International Ministry that today, as far as I can tell, is one of the largest of these apostolic networks in the world. They claim that they have 25,000 or more ministries in 65 countries that are all looking, not individuals, ministries, like churches that are all looking to Chayon as the apostle. That they might be exaggerating a little bit, but it's definitely thousands. I mean, it is a very large network that is even legendary in these circles today. And Chayon has become, in many ways, one of the most respected apostles, not only in the United States, but in the world, in these kind of apostolic and prophetic fivefold ministry circles. He is just a top-notch leader in that world, globally famous, and is granted a degree of respect and authority that there are very few people in that movement who have that level.
I can see that he was a very driven pastor when I knew him, and to add to your story, our church was relatively successful, but there was a fallout with People of Destiny, right? And that's part of the other part of that story was that People of Destiny, they were trying to control. Ironically, they were trying to control our church with their apostles, and they weren't going on the same bus. They weren't on the same bus that Chay wanted to go on, right? So that was part of it. It's like, okay, right, we want apostles, but not that way. We want to do it a different way, right? So they branched off. So that was that. There was that church split going on. But you're absolutely right about him. He's become extremely influential and famous in that movement. And he is a Korean American too. So we have to remember that, like you say in the book, this isn't just white Christian nationalism. Okay, there are some churches like Chay's church that are diverse churches with people from all over, from different ethnic groups, and they're on board. And this is global. There's people all over the world that are on board with this kind of an apostolic structure, right?
Yes, and this is where in our kind of common parlance and our common vocabulary, the phrase white Christian nationalism is often used as synonymous with American Christian nationalism.
Right.
And there really is a thing called white Christian nationalism. That really is a force in American politics. That is a style of Christian nationalism in the United States. I would argue, though, there are other kinds of Christian nationalism in the United States. And I think that these New Apostolic Reformation and other independent charismatic networks tend to be very multi-ethnic, both at the leadership level and the followership level. And as you're saying, they're globally interconnected. So the frame of white Christian nationalism actually doesn't work very well here, because would you call the apostles and prophets who are trying to take over Brazil part of white Christian nationalism? What about Nigeria?
Yeah,
right. What about Russia? Right. Like, I mean, so there's a dimension of this that, at least in the United States, definitely is inflected with race, because American Christianity is embedded with race in complicated and weird and lamentable ways. But this is a more multi-ethnic style of, and I don't even know that Christian nationalism is always the right term for it, because part of what I'm arguing in the book is, when you think about nationalism is obsessed with borders and boundaries. It's obsessed with shoring up a sense of American identity over and against the rest of the world. That's not really the vibe within these New Apostolic Reformation circles. In fact, they have a very international and transnational focus, a global focus. And they want, that's where I think it's more useful to think of them as networks of Christian supremacy that interface with Christian nationalism. So in the same way that you can talk about white supremacy as kind of a transnational movement of elevating white people over other kinds of people, that sometimes manifests as white nationalism, but is actually has these broader trends. I would say that Christian supremacy is similar in that the goal is Christian hegemony over every nation, but sometimes it aligns with more nationalistic movements, as we see.
Right. Yeah, that's a good distinction. So I want to touch on a couple of things that are really about this movement and what they push and promote that really is anti-democratic. And one of the things is, well, I'll ask you about another player in this movement, a guy named Dutch Sheets. And he came up with this view, as you say in the book, that the church, or the Eklesia in the Greek term is God's governing body. And he's really going beyond what most evangelicals would say about church. But tell us about Dutch Sheets and this view that he has.
So Dutch Sheets is another one of these figures who kind of gravitates towards Wagner's orbit in the 1990s. He's a pastor, he's an apostle, he's a prophet. And he becomes friends with Peter Wagner, becomes a mentee of Wagner's, and he joins up with these new Apostolic Reformation networks as they get going. And over time, he and Wagner had a bit of a falling out. It wasn't hostile so much as Dutch Sheets just has a very strong independent streak, but they were still friends. And he was still deeply connected to all these networks. And in 2013, Dutch Sheets was the executive director at a charismatic Bible college called Christ for the Nations Institute in Dallas, and he is participating in a graduation ceremony. And the speaker at the ceremony, who's a mentee of Dutch Sheets, hands him a flag and says, "This is a really important flag." And the flag, it's a white flag with a green pine tree at the center of it, and the phrase across the top is an appeal to heaven. And this becomes it's a Revolutionary War flag, and it's a symbol from the Revolutionary War that flew over the Massachusetts Navy. But Dutch Sheets believes that this flag is a prophecy of a revolution that's going to take place in America, and this dovetails and connects with Sheets' other major theological idea that you were gesturing towards of the Eklesia. That's how they pronounce it.
Right.
No, that's Ecclesia is more Latin. Eklesia is more Greek. Right. Not a big deal. But the idea that Sheets has, and this is again, it's another style of dominion theology, another way of using some of these kind of dominion frames. But this one is built around this idea of the Eklesia, and Eklesia in Greek just means assembly.
Yes.
It's a synonym of synagoga, the synagogue, right? And so in the early church, when they talk about the Eklesia, they're really just kind of talking about the gathering of Christians.
Exactly.
Like the assembly of Christians.
Yep.
But the term in Greek has other resonances, right? And so in the same way that we could talk today about the term assembly in English can mean just a group of people. It can mean a church. It can also mean the state assembly.
Right.
Like the legislative assembly. That same range of meanings is there. And in some points during the Roman Republic, they would talk about the gathering of the legislative body as the gathering of the Ecclesia. Now that was not the usage in Jesus' time, right?
No,
right, because the Roman Republic was gone by that point. But this word was still there in Greek, and the early church started using it. So Dutch Sheets believes that this term he develops an entire interpretation of the Bible built around one word. And he says this term Eklesia is meant to say that the church is the real governing legislative body on earth.
That's amazing.
And the church is supposed, and he'll even go to the model of Roman colonization.
Yeah.
And say, well, when the Romans would colonize a new area, they would send an assembly, a delegation of leaders to go and create the culture of Rome, to reproduce the culture of Rome in that colony. And so that is the mission of the church, according to Dutch Sheets, is to take that we are the Ecclesia, a colonizing force sent from heaven to bring the culture of heaven to bear on the earth. They literally will invoke the model of colonization as the mission of the church. And this is and he's saying that this is Jesus' message. Jesus, who himself was a colonized Jew living under the Roman Empire, who was executed at the behest of the Roman Empire because he would not conform to their paradigm of power. Dutch Sheets is saying, but he really did embrace their paradigm of power and was trying to perpetuate it in his church.
And Jesus also said, don't lord it over others like the Gentiles do, meaning the Romans in power.
Yes.
So no, it's totally turning on its head. It's crazy. That's a really important point. And then another thing that people need to understand is that there's a lot of fear mongering going on in this movement and in evangelicalism as well. It's just, we're saved, they're lost. We've got the Holy Spirit, they're influenced by demons or whatever. All this us versus them. How did they fear monger Biden and Harris and Obama? I mean, the language that they use when they're talking about we're up against this great, enemy, and it's also natural and it's supernatural. Tell us about that.
Yeah, so and this connects then with the way that Sheets is thinking about these ideas of Eklesia and appeal to heaven, because all this is happening during the Obama administration, right?
Yeah.
So they had all their hopes pinned on Palin, and then during the Obama administration, they just experienced as the season of desolation, because the United States is living under, as they perceive it, this liberal tyranny. That abortion rights are progressing, LGBTQ rights are progressing, and they feel like and Dutch Sheets has even mimicked the language and echoed the claim that Barack Obama was a secret Muslim, and so they believed that there was this liberal tyranny, and so the idea of the Eklesia is like, oh, we're the real government. That the Obama administration is actually the fake government. We're Satan's government. We're God's government.
Right.
And then when the appeal to heaven flag gets integrated in, they're saying we need a spiritual revolution to overturn this liberal tyranny of the Obama administration to bring about God's order, God's government in the United States. And so Sheets takes these ideas, he starts promoting them. He writes a book called An Appeal to Heaven that promotes this flag. He's trying to get Christians to fly the flag as a symbol of Christian nationalism, especially Christian lawmakers, trying to get Christian lawmakers to appropriate this flag as a kind of coded symbol of Christian nationalism. And all of this bursts on the scene in 2015, right around the same time as Donald Trump is entering the political picture. And so all of these things get entwined with Donald Trump. The symbolism of the appeal to heaven flag. And also you have to remember, right like a week after Donald Trump enters the presidential race in June of 2015, the Supreme Court hands down its Obergefell gay marriage decision.
Oh, right. Yeah. Right.
And so the feeling in the religious right is that this is the nadir of their power, right? They spent decades trying to construct a Supreme Court that will do their will, getting the right justices onto the Supreme Court that will enforce their will. And then the Supreme Court comes along on a cause that they have fought decades against, the recognition of same-sex marriage. And the Supreme Court that they have tried to invest in puts that as the national policy that is allowed across the land. And in these Christian rights circles, they experience that as just, we have lost everything. We have lost all of our power. We need a bully who can fight for us. And that's when Trump hits the scene, right? That's the part of this backstory of why evangelicals become so attached to Trump, because they think we don't need another George W. Bush. We don't need another compassionate conservative. We need a bully. We need a Cyrus. We need somebody who's going to fight.
We've tried compassionate conservative. That didn't work. So
yeah. And so then this becomes, again, the appeal to heaven flag, the 7 mountains, the Cyrus anointing. These are the messages. These are the memes that are being used by these NAR leaders and other Christians to vindicate Christian Trump support. Say, we need a revolution. He's the leader of our revolution. We need a Cyrus. He's our Cyrus, right? And that becomes then this groundswell of Christian support for Trump. And the appeal to heaven flag and the Eklesia idea also get wrapped up around Donald Trump. And so these folks, as Trump comes into power in 2017 after the election, these people become his advisors. They become the prayer warriors who are driving the action in the Christian community in support of Donald Trump. And these images of the 7 mountains, of the appeal to heaven, become wrapped up with Trump and become almost synonymous with the Christian support for Donald Trump. Right. And that's why we see appeal to heaven flags everywhere on January 6th. I mean, there's at least dozens, maybe even hundreds of appeal to heaven flags in the crowds around the Capitol. If you go to a Christian nationalist, Christian right rally today, I can virtually guarantee that you will see appeal to heaven flags flying there, that people will be invoking these images and talking about the seven mountains, right? Because these ideas that were fringy a decade ago
now they're
are now
mainstream.
central and mainstream to the
Right.
work of the Christian right.
That's fascinating. I remember a neighbor of mine who is definitely leaning that way had an appeal to heaven flag in front of his house once a couple of years ago. And I didn't know what it was. I was like, oh, I remember that from like history class or something. One of the little flags in the corner and on a page somewhere that the revolutionaries used. But why are Christians using it? So that explains that. So,
well, and just a coda on that.
Yeah.
When Mike Johnson became the Speaker of the House of Representatives, he flies an appeal to heaven flag outside of his office. And when my colleague Bradley Anish and I, when we wrote this up, we reached out through Rolling Stone to ask what the flag meant to him and where he got it. And he said, oh, I got it from such and such a pastor. It was an NAR pastor who gave it to him. And Mike Johnson is very close to a disciple of Dutch Sheets who is in his district, an apostle in Shreveport, Louisiana. And Mike Johnson hangs out with NAR apostles, joins them for events, has spoken at their events. So, and then we also found out last summer that the Supreme Court Justice Samuel Alito flew an appeal to heaven flag at his summer.
Oh, yeah, he did too. Okay.
Right. And he blamed it on his wife, right? But like, so you see this, this symbol that originates within these kind of NAR circles is a coded symbol of Christian nationalism, Christian supremacy, is now being embraced by leaders at the top of all three branches of our government. The judicial with Mike Johnson, the legislative with Johnson, right? The judicial with Samuel Alito, and then the executive with Donald Trump.
So let's jump to January 6th and just talk about that a little bit before we ask some of the questions about what is the solution of this. We don't have to go there, but I just want to make a comment that's in your book. Chayon, my former pastor, was in Washington, D.C. He made a speech on January 5th. There was a rally before January 6th that he spoke at. And in that speech, he said, we're going to rule and reign through President Trump and under the lordship of Jesus Christ. So that's the mindset that these people had, that Trump was going to become president again, and we would continue to rule and reign through him, whether you call it under the lordship of Jesus Christ or not. So, and then the other thing was, you talked about some of the White House access that these folks had right before January 6th, after the election. And maybe even, I'm sure they had access beforehand, but after the election, and there's this, claim that the election is stolen, and Trump says, come to a rally on January 6th. It's going to be wild. You talk about these folks having access to him at the White House. And I just want to read this quote, and you can put it in context. And I think I forgot who said this, but strategy was given to us. This is one of the NAR leaders. Strategy was given to us at the White House from people in the know around there, and I cannot really talk about it. Do you remember that quote?
I do. So this was actually one of the things that most surprised me in my research, because when I was doing this research, I was like, oh man, I'm finding all the stuff that the media was not paying attention to, that nobody was writing about, that nobody was noticing, but was going on in the background. I was like, oh, this is kind of the spiritual backstory to January 6th. And then I started discovering all these connections within the Trump administration. So Paula White Cain, right, by November of 2019 had gotten an office, an official role within the White House. And so there was not like there's a direct connection for these leaders into the White House.
Okay, so Paula White had an office.
She did, right. but then and that was known. But what I didn't know, and what I discovered in the course of researching, was that once the election gets called for Joe Biden in 2020, and Donald Trump denies the results of the election, almost immediately these NAR leaders and their allies launch straight into spiritual warfare blitzkrieg mode. We need to mobilize Christians around this stuff. But the Trump administration was aware of this. The media wasn't watching it. The public didn't know about it. The Trump administration knew about it. And they were cultivating these leaders. They were cultivating these sentiments, and they were driving some of the action. So Dutch Sheets goes to Washington, D.C. right just after the election gets called in November of 2020. And he meets with some people from the Trump administration. He's never said who, but he's talked about it in many of the different venues, how he met with people from within the Trump administration. And they said, hey, Dutch, why don't you go to all of the swing states where they're battling over the results of the election, where Rudy Giuliani and Sidney Powell and other of Trump's lawyers are fighting this in the courts, and go and lead a spiritual warfare crusade in the swing states. And so Dutch Sheets gathers a team of 15 to 20 NAR apostles and prophets, and they start barnstorming the swing states. And this is in like late November of 2020. And they're holding these mass gatherings in the swing states, hundreds of thousands of people watching these things online, the incredibly violent rhetoric of spiritual warfare, talking about we're mobilizing the militias of the kingdom of God. We're going to cut the heads off of our enemies in the spiritual world, right? And just deeply violent prophesying rhetoric. That team, on December 29th, 2020, they come to Washington, D.C. for on very short notice. And on December 29th in the afternoon, this is 8 days before January 6th, they have a 2-hour meeting with unnamed White House officials.
Right.
And again, these are some of the most violent instigators of Christian mobilization for January 6th. And they have a meeting in the White House, and they come out of that meeting saying things like what you just read. They're saying things like, we were getting strategy from people in the know. Our voices were being heard at the highest levels of the U.S. government. And they start hinting that they know that there's something important coming. There's a big battle coming. And again, this is just 8 days before January 6th. Some of those same leaders show up on January 6th and participate. So there's this backstory of the Trump administration was paying attention to the spiritual warfare mobilization. They were even instigating and utilizing it as another wing of the pressure campaign to put pressure on Congress and to get the Christians involved.
Right. Yeah. No, that makes sense. That's the way to get more people involved, to use the Christians this way.
Yep.
So the other thing that as January 6th unfolds, and you can see that it's obviously violent, and it goes south. I mean, even these people were looking at what was going on and going, wait a minute, what is this really what's happening? There's another quote you have in here. I don't know who says it. Someone's on a call. Maybe it was Dutch Sheets, because Dutch Sheets didn't go to January 6th, right?
Yeah.
He was on a call though that day, and they were watching it unfold on the television. And he says, I just want to encourage everyone not to get too freaked out about what's happening. None of us like to see it. It all stirs up. And then he goes on. So it was like, okay, something's going wrong here. What was their reaction to all this? How did they gloss over the violence? Why didn't people just immediately go, wait a minute, we didn't sign up for this. Something's wrong. Well, why didn't that happen?
I know this is going to be hard for many people to believe, but as far as I can tell, these NAR leaders do not see any connection between their violent rhetoric, their mobilization of Christians to be there for January 6th, their own participation in January 6th, and the violence that played out that day. Yeah. In their minds, we are doing spiritual warfare. That's all we're doing. We're just praying.
Yeah, we're
just prophesying, right?
They have very, very precise language that has the language of violence in it.
Yes. And that's part of the argument of the book is I'm not saying that these were the people who did everything on January 6th. Obviously, there's a lot of forces involved in January 6th. Proud Boys, Oath Keepers, QAnon, Stop the Steal, Trump. All right. I mean, there were a lot of actors that day. And I'm also not saying that these people perpetuated violence themselves. They created the conditions, the theological conditions, the permission structures, and the rhetorical universe in which Christians could perpetuate violence, right? They created the permission structure and using theology and prophecy and all this violent rhetoric. And they pointed at the building and they pointed at the Democratic Party and said, we have to stop the demons. We have to fight the demons. The demons are in that body. The demons are in that group. And their followers took it to the logical conclusion of, okay, we need to stop the demons. The demons are in those people. We have to stop those people.
True. Right. And then add that to that, Trump saying Pence has got to do the right thing. And then what do you got? You get a whole formula, a whole recipe. You mix it all together, and of course they're going to storm the Capitol and try to break down the doors and come against policemen violently. So it makes sense, but why can't they connect the dots? It's just amazing.
I think you might need a psychologist for that.
Well, I mean, the answer to me is that there's this sense that this is a mighty. In other words, if you admit that part of your process has got some major flaws in it, you're going to have to admit a lot of other flaws, and the whole house of cards might come tumbling down. And no one wants to go there, right?
And they do not want to dial back their rhetoric at all,
right?
And so, as long as they can claim it's just spiritual, they can keep doing this,
right? But the other side of it is also, why can't they just, why, even after all this, even the 61 court cases that didn't go in Trump's favor, there's the legislation, and I mean, excuse me, there's no lack of evidence for a real fraud. I mean, that's what I can't understand. Are they just conspiracy theorists and they just refuse to believe that, or what?
So, I mean, yeah, they are conspiracy theorists for sure. And they also are operating in right-wing information ecosystems through news media and through the circles that they travel in, the relational circles there, and they never hear anything else. I mean, like they truly are closed off.
Oh, they really are in a bubble.
But part of it too is, and if you think about it, like many of the people who supported the Stop the Steal movement, who were trying to overturn the election, believed it was conspiracy of Democrats and disloyal Republicans, and eventually Mike Pence, right? And that was the narrative. In the NAR circles, that was happening, but it was a conspiracy of demons.
Yeah, right.
Like that was just the manifestation. And so that what they're doing on January 6th is we have to take out the conspiracy of demons behind these human actors.
Yeah.
And so if it's a conspiracy of demons that's stealing the election, you don't need evidence.
Yes. Right.
They're like, we have prophets. The prophets are telling us.
Right. Exactly. That's what I'm saying.
And it can look like a completely normal election. It can look like a completely democratic election.
Right.
But if the demons are behind it, then it was stolen.
And if people and prophets and apostles are saying, I heard from God, and then you kind of dissect that and deconstruct it and realize, maybe you didn't hear from God. They can't go there because they've already heard from God, and they would it would just destroy their whole theological foundation, I think.
Exactly.
Yeah, that makes more sense. But really a fascinating story, especially just how it transpired, and there's a programming that's going on, and no one can kind of get out of that bubble and look at it objectively. It's very difficult to do that because they've been in that bubble for years. I know people who have been in that movement for decades, and 30, 40, 50, 40 years, and that's just the way they've been thinking all their life.
Yes.
Right? So it's hard to get out of that. So what about in your research? What are the plans that they have for this election? Same as the above, right?
I mean, when it comes to American presidential elections, the NAR really only has one playbook.
Yeah.
And the playbook is to mobilize their people to vote, to do mass campaigns of spiritual warfare in the lead up to the election, and then if the conditions are right, to fight back against the results of the election. They didn't fight back, at least not in any kind of physical or mass way, against the results of the 2008 or 2012 election. But the conditions, and then they, of course, in their view, they won the 2016 election. But when it came to 2020, the conditions were right because Donald Trump was playing along. Right, Donald Trump was resisting the results of the election, and that gave the prophets who had prophesied his victory the space to be able to say, we're still fighting too, right? And we still know God's will. We need to fight back. So the question as we come into this election, and right now, I mean, I went to a mass gathering of NAR folks on the National Mall just a couple weeks ago. tens of thousands, maybe 100,000 people there, organized by Lou Engel and Chayon.
Oh, really?
And,
Okay.
oh yeah, they call it the Million Women March.
Oh, right. I've heard about
10,
that. Yeah.
10 hours of prophecy and spiritual warfare and blowing shofars and appeal to heaven flags and worship music. And then at the end, Chayon reprised his January 5th speech and said Donald Trump is a Jehu, Kamala Harris is a Jezebel. If you listen carefully to what he said on October 12th this year, it's functionally a spiritual death order on Kamala Harris. He's invoking the execution of Jezebel and saying she's Jezebel.
This is part of the fear mongering too, right?
Absolutely. And so they're trying to galvanize their people. Lance Wallnau is going through all the swing states, trying to mobilize voters around this stuff. They are also continuing to spread these lies about the 2020 election, saying this election is going to be hijacked. They're going to try, the demons and the Democrats are going to try to do it again. And so they're very much mimicking Trump's rhetoric, still using prophecies. I mean, the assassination attempts on Trump have only cemented these narratives for them that God is protecting Trump against these nefarious evil forces. And so I'm very worried coming into this election, because if Trump wins, these are the Christian extremists who will surround him and advise him, and they'll have a lot of power over policy in a second Trump administration, because Trump sees them as his most loyal base. He tries to give them what he wants.
Unfortunately, that makes sense.
And if Trump loses, if Trump is declared the loser, I don't see a scenario in which Donald Trump does not deny the results of this election. I don't think in his constitution and who he is, I don't think he can admit defeat. And in 2020, he wanted 4 more years of sitting around the West Wing watching Fox News. Today, if he loses this election, there's a very good chance he's going to prison. So how far is Donald Trump willing to push things if he loses this election?
Yeah,
I don't know. And these folks will go along with it.
Yeah,
they will be in lockstep, and they'll offer the theology for it.
Right. It's the theology, the fear mongering. I mean, the fear mongering is just outrageous. People might not know what the Jezebel spirit is, but it's a bad spirit, right?
Yes.
and so I mean, it's just like calling people. I think Lance Wallnau claimed that Kamala Harris was now influenced by an evil spirit, and
multiple times.
Right. So all this stuff is it's just crazy. And no one, anyways, what we have a big problem, and we've got we don't know exactly what's going to happen. But I guess the other question is, no matter what happens, all right, whether Harris wins and there's still problems because of the pushback, or whether Trump wins and takes control and these people help him rule and reign under Trump, what can be done to defeat this Christian supremacist movement and to oppose it and hopefully persuade people to reject it?
One of the challenges, it's a big one, of having a pluralistic democracy is that democracy requires a lot of work. Democracy is fragile. Democracy is not a state of being that is stable and consistent. Democracy is active, right? We all have to participate. We all have to join in. We all have to vote. We all have to advocate our causes, and we all have to play by the rules. And the vulnerability of democracy, the Achilles heel of democracy, and the American founders knew this, is populist authoritarian movements.
Okay.
Is populist authoritarian movements can use the mechanisms of democracy, free expression, free speech, freedom of assembly, to mobilize and galvanize a portion of the populace that they can weaponize against democracy. And that is what the MAGA movement is. It's a populist authoritarian movement that has taken over the Republican Party that is anti-democratic, right? Mm-hmm. And the NAR and these other independent charismatic fellow travelers of theirs, they have provided the spiritual wing of that populist authoritarianism. Now, the challenge is, if you're a democracy and you have a populist authoritarian movement growing within you, how do you stop that?
Right.
Well, you can repress it, but then you're forsaking democracy.
Yeah,
you're violating your own constitution.
Right.
Right. So, I mean, I don't see a policy solution to this. I don't see a legal solution to this. Right. These folks are protected under the First Amendment. They did not commit violence. According to the Supreme Court's definition of instigation to violence, I don't think they committed instigation to violence. So I think this is a civic crisis. It's a civic crisis. It's a crisis within Christianity, within American Christianity. And I end the book by calling American Christians to stand up for to this and to speak to this, to use theology to try to reason with these folks. But it's also a civic crisis that 1/3 of the US population today believes the 2020 election was stolen. And if you look among white evangelicals, it's more like 2/3.
Yeah.
That it's very, very hard to have a pluralistic democracy if 1/3 of the country is saying we're not playing by your rules and we don't accept the legitimacy of your government.
Right.
So there's that epistemic, the crisis of how we know what we know, that underlies everything that is the political and civil crisis that we're facing today. And that we have to deal with. We have to find ways to speak across these divides, to reason. And I don't have any illusions about that being easy. But I mean, the other paths are authoritarianism and in the long run, civil war. And right. So I think let's try to find the non-violent pluralist solutions that we can.
Absolutely. And the question is, how many people are really persuadable? And I know there are some, because I don't think as many evangelicals today have supported Trump as they did in 2016 and 2020. But and there's other groups like Evangelicals for Harris, and there's people like David French, and I know some of these other folks, Rob Schenck. I don't know if you know Reverend Rob Schenck.
I know who he is. I've never met him.
Yeah, so he was right in there, but now he's against the Trumpism, etc. So there are voices out there, but so how many people are persuadable is the question, and how do we do it? How do you do it? That's another question.
So I sometimes make a distinction because if we think about Christian nationalism in the U.S., it's a spectrum, right? And there are hardline Christian nationalists, and that's who I'm writing about in my book.
Yeah.
The NAR leaders are not persuadable. I've talked to some of them.
Right.
They are not persuadable.
Right.
They are locked in, as you were saying. They've spent decades doing this. They've got a shtick, and they're sticking to it.
Right.
Some of their followers are.
Yep.
And there are other leaders in the charismatic world who are persuadable. The challenge is that they're stuck in kind of a leadership culture that has warped itself around Donald Trump. And it's very, very hard to break free and to speak your mind if you are opposed to that in that space, because all the financial incentives and all the relational incentives are pushing you in one direction.
Right.
And so part of what right now, I'm an associate fellow with this organization called Center for Peace Diplomacy. And we're trying to gather some groups of Pentecostal and charismatic leaders who are opposed to Christian nationalism, opposed to Christian supremacy, and have them speak out and have them kind of in coalition say, this is not fair representation of our movement. This is not representative of the gospel. We need to participate and embrace democracy. I'm not holding out any illusions that's going to be a silver bullet that's going to solve this thing.
That's a place to start, though.
But better to light a candle.
Yeah, it makes sense. Okay. All right, folks. Thanks, Matthew, so much for coming on our Spiritual Brew Pub. We really appreciate it. The book is The Violent Take It by Force, the Christian movement that threatens our democracy. A must read to understand the background of all the things that are going on politically in our country. Very, very important. So we'll put it in the show notes. And also, is there anything else you want to put in the show notes? You have a website or something?
Yeah, so I work at the Institute for Islamic, Christian, and Jewish Studies in Baltimore. We're an interreligious dialogue and pluralism institute. We work on combating anti-Semitism and Islamophobia and challenging Christian nationalism. We have all kinds of programs going on. It's icjs.org. And all of our programs are free and open to the public. Some of them I'm leading, some of them my colleagues, but people can check us out and join our mailing list and become a part of the work we do.
That sounds good. I'd like to talk to you about that because I also have a lot of interest in Christian-Muslim relations or just Muslim relations in our country. That's
my other area of specialization. So happy to talk about that sometime.
That's perfect. I lived for 7 years in Muslim communities in Africa. So, okay. Thank you again, Matthew, for coming on. Folks, get the book, check out the show notes, and until next time, enjoy responsibly.